Is that better? Let's say it loud. Ooh, that's really loud. Wow. Turn me down. Are you ready? Shema Israel. Adonai Eloneinu. Adonai Had. Vehavata. Et Adonai Eloheha. Vehol Levahaka. Uvo Nehavshaka. Uvo Motika. Vahavata. Lerahaka. Kamocha. I feel like I say it different every time, too. You may be seated. Father God, thank you for this day. Thank you for these people. Thank you for this heritage that you have blessed us with. And we ask that you give us something today to take with us, learn, be able to use in our lives. In Christ's name, amen. All right, everybody go to 1 Chronicles, deep in the bowels of the Old Testament. I did. Let me turn it on. Leave it on in case you find it. Something. All right, so we finished up last week talking about Moses. So that puts us 3,000 years into the history of mankind, okay? So we're going into about 1,000 BC, give or take, all right? And we're going to study the next guy in line, which is David. Now, we've talked about this dispensationalism topic. Everybody know what this means? It gives you the hint up on the screen. In the fullness of time, as God reveals himself to mankind, he does it in his own way, in his own time, in his own procedures, okay? You have two covenants that are active at this point in time, right? So the first one that we live under that still applies to us today is the Adamic covenant. Where basically, once sin entered the world, it became the way it was with the women, with the childbirth. Men got to toil and the sweat and the stickers and the dominion over the animal. All that still exists, right? Those are left over from the time that when man sinned and God set up his new rules, his new covenant with him, right? That's what it's under. So, and then you've progressed through Noah, which is a kind of, it's where he destroyed and started over, but it was the same rules with a little variations. And then went to Abraham. When the Abrahamic covenant is still in existence even today because, why? It can never be broken. It's eternal, right? So all the promises that God made Abraham at that point, he gave him the descendants that would number the sands upon the seashores and the stars in the sky and all that stuff. And then started the Jewish race, okay? And then you moved into Moses and giving them the law. So all that's kind of still into effect. And David comes along. He is a son of a guy named Jesse, and he's the youngest of 8, all right, which really doesn't compute well with the whole inheritor of the promise thing. Typically, it's the firstborn, the oldest son. But that's kind of how God works all these, and that it's somewhat comes unexpectedly and uses those that are kind of the lowest of the line. And that's kind of what happened here. And you know the story of David when he was brought forth, and he said, you're going to be the one. They tried all 7 brothers, because when Samuel showed up to talk to Jesse about it, he said, one of your kids is going to be the king of Israel. And he said, okay, cool. I've got a bunch of them here. Let's try these. So we went through all 7. It's not none of these. Where's the other? There's got to be another one. He said, well, the other one's a little bitty kid. He's out being a shepherd. So they bring him in and said, he's the one. So, again, God using stuff that you wouldn't typically expect, all right? They anoint him. Israel at that point has a king that God gave them, Saul, that becomes opposite of what God wants him to do, right? So that's kind of where you're at in history. You go through all the stuff from Abraham to Moses. Now you're into the king era, and Saul, the first king of Israel. And there would be many, but this is where it goes from there, okay? And so David, this ruddy young man, they called him in the Bible, kind of, I guess, redheaded maybe, and fair-skinned, gingery, and he's a pretty intense kid. You know the story of David. He killed lions with his bare hands to protect his sheep and all that stuff. And he brings forth one of the coolest stories in the Bible, which we'll probably get to today, maybe not. But looking at the stories of David is in the Chronicles, and through Samuel, through those books of the Bible. A lot of it correlates with each other. So let's look at 1 Chronicles 17. I'm going to read that to you. Everybody go to 17. We'll start in verse 7. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone. I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name like the name of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also subdue all your enemies. I declare to you that the Lord will build a house for you. When your days are over and you go to be with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will never take my love away from him as I took it away from your predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever. So if you look at all that, there's old David and his famous story. They referred to him as a man after God's own heart. Does that mean he's a perfect man? Have you ever thought about that? That in our lives, as we live out godly principles or not, we are made in God's image. So a lot of what we do and say and think and how we are shaped or whatever it is, that's God created us and loves us out of his own image. David referred to that. David certainly was not a perfect man. He committed some sins, and his house was so messy. His kids were so rebellious for the most part, right? Remember that story? We'll talk about that. But Mashiach is the anointed one, is what it means in the scriptures. And David is actually anointed with oil, which is another part of covenant. Like, you're giving that man the ultimate honor, the title of king. And that's how they did that. And some of that stuff is even left over until today. Now, do you know much about Saul? Remember what Saul kind of was? Israel's like, man, we want a king like everybody else. They didn't have one. God is your king. They said, no. We want a king like everybody else. So God gave him this guy, and he was a little taller and good looking, and presented him. And the first it went really well. And as time progressed, Saul get further away from God. And at some point, Samuel anoints David to be the king while Saul is still the king. And this is all kept secret somewhat. But Saul knows. And how Saul finds out that he's no longer the chosen one of God is one of the most unique stories of the Bible. Go to 1 Samuel 28 now. I'm going to read this to you too. 1 Samuel 28. This is no matter what you believe about spiritual warfare going on in this world. Do you believe that? Do you believe that there's spiritual beings amongst us that are both good and bad? You should, because the Bible says that is so. Do you believe that ghosts exist upon the earth? Ooh. I want to talk about that? Let's talk about this. Look at this story. So Saul wants to know what the scoop is. He's not hearing from God. He's rebelled. He's sinned. God basically has cut him off at this point. And he goes to see a fortune teller. This is a great story. So 1 Samuel 28, verse 3. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and the spiritualists from the land. God told him to do that. The Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Saul said then this to his attendants, find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her. There is one in Endor, they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes. At night he and two men went to the woman. Consult a spirit for me, he said, and bring up for me the one I name. But the woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" The lady didn't know that she was talking to Saul. So Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Well, whom shall I bring up for you?" He said, "Bring up Samuel." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a ghostly figure coming out of the earth." "What does he look like?" he asked. "He's an old man wearing a robe, and he's coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, bowed down, and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. It sounds like Saul didn't really think that that could have happened. Here we are. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I was trying to go to heaven." "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams, so I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands, given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." That's a pretty solemn statement. You're going to die. "The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all day and all that night. I don't know about y'all, but that to me is a crazy story about Saul. Anyway, so this is the point where, at this point, he's within 24 hours of death. And obviously when he pulls full length on the ground, he's very distraught about what has happened. So if you look in the whole outlay of things, there are 20, let me show you something cool. There are 28 generations between Adam and Abraham. Okay? And guess what? Between Abraham and David, there are 28 generations. And you guessed that between David and Christ, there are how many generations? 28. So it's laid out into groups of 3 like that. So we're, again, about 1,000 years before Christ when this occurs. We've read that. We just read that. So let's look at a couple of things. Somebody has 1 Samuel 18, I know. David, a descendant of Abraham, will continue the bloodline of Christ. And then there's one of the coolest relationships that we're going to display the covenant relationship out of is Saul's son, Jonathan, with David, because they become really good friends. And so they enter into covenant together as a son. And Jonathan knows his dad has been cut off from God. Jonathan knows David is going to be the inheritor of the promise. And he's not bitter about it because he himself believes his dad messed some things up. Read that, Jolene.
Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt.
So this is significant that they trade weapons and clothing, because that's had become part of that relationship, and that, I'm giving you my most prized possession. In those days, the warriors that they would become, and they exchanged it. Where have you seen this before? There's been other parts, and we talked about it. Dennis has got the next reading. If you go back to some of the books out that are not canonized in the Bible, I think I told you this, that garment that, who are the 2 sons of Isaac? Jacob and Esau. That garment that Esau was the hairy one, but the garment that Jacob and his mom put on him so that his dad would feel him and think it was Esau. Okay? There's a lot of historical evidence that points to that garment passed all the way down through the generations and became that garment that Dennis is about to read to you about. Okay, read that for us, sir.
This is Genesis 37, 3 through 8.
Yes, sir.
Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said.
So this garment that he gives him is a very historical, family, heirloom type thing. Like I said, I can't tell you this for sure, but that kind of deal points out that he is the inheritor of the promise. So that coat of many colors that we call it in the little kids' Bibles that you read when you're a kid is very significant in that he is the one that's going to be inheritor. And it says why he said he was the favorite son, because he was born to him in his old age. But that very significant in the fact that Jonathan and David at this point exchanged weapons, exchanged tunics, those type of things. Very much a significant of, I'm entering into covenant with you as a friend. I know that at one point my dad is going to die, and you're going to be the king of Israel, and we're going to swear to each other, we're going to behold each other. The armor thing is significant, and it's biblical. If you think about Jewish history in that time period, those people, basically everybody in the country would have been a soldier, right? Everybody has swords and spears, and except the women maybe, but even maybe them. But the point is they spent their entire lives a lot of times at odds with many other Philistines and the other people around them. So that's significant. Who's got Ephesians 6:13? You do, Evan? You read that. So good Jews would have understood this a lot more significant in their culture, because like I say, they all were warriors, and they all knew that defending the nation was the priority, which honestly, if you look at the Israelis today, they're all required to be in the army when they turn 18. And they're all given a military weapon, and they're all basically conscripted into service and have to serve a number of years and are basically that way for the rest of their lives. I know Barry talked about when they went to Israel the first time, and their guide was a Messianic Jew. He was in his 40s and had served his time, was no longer a full-time soldier, but they give you a weapon. And so the Israelis, even to this day, that's part of their culture and their significance, because basically they're living at odds with those Arab countries that surround them. So anyway, you can go back and look at these pieces of things that are exchanged, and they're very significant. Does anyone have something that was given to them by their grandparents that they have at their house that's important to you? Like what? What do you give? What do you get from people? Do you get you have any of your granddad's guns? See? Jewelry? Why that? Why not a guitar? An ashtray? I mean, do you have any silverware plates passed down from some generation. You see, those kind of things would be considered significant because of they're important. They may be of some value, not maybe to anybody else. They might, maybe a piece of jewelry does, but that's the kind of thing that's passed down in your family heritage, no different than this. When Jonathan gives him his tunic and David gives him his, it's exchanging it between families. They're not brothers. They're not related, but that's signifying that we basically are saying we're committed to each other and going to protect each other for the rest of our lives. Then, as Saul, and you've heard the story too, and you read it in the Bible, where Saul is troubled in his spirit. He says, David, come play. You're my harpist. Come play me some songs. And he plays him some songs. And Saul throws something at him across the room when he's in there playing some songs. And David's got to run out of the room, right? You remember that story? And then him and Jonathan meet. And he said, look, I'm going to have to see what's going on. And if I shoot my arrows a certain distance, that means you're safe. Anyway, they come to the spot. 1 Samuel 23:15 through 18. Who's got that? All right, you going to go over there, Haley? So this is post that occurring when David and Saul get together, or David and Jonathan get together.
Now David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life while David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horish. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horish and encouraged him in God. Thus he said to him, do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also. So that the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed at Horish while Jonathan went to his house.
So basically what he's doing there is committing to, if you're going to inherit the family line and you're going to be the king, I need you to protect my family. And this is shown through the Bible. Have you ever heard of a character in the Bible named Mephibosheth? He was a lame man. It was lame in both of his feet, a son of Jonathan. And when Jonathan's gone and dead, and Mephibosheth, David invites him to live at his house. And he basically is a handicapped person. That's pretty tough in those days. He's going to protect him for the rest of his life. And there was times that Mephibosheth did some stuff that probably didn't deserve to be protected, but that was a commitment, because these covenants, they're binding, and they're life and death and all that sort of stuff. Go to 2 Samuel 7. Second Samuel 7, and let's start in verse 11. Now, I told you, 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles a lot of times have the same stories. They're parallel images. They're different, written by different people in the Bible. Verse 11, chapter 7, 1 Samuel, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood. I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. That sounds almost identical to the one that we read a while ago in Chronicles, because here, and this is what the whole point of today is, this covenant that God made with David is so much more about the lineage. At this point, all these traditions we've heard, passing on of robes or of jewelry or of important, significant things through family lines, those have been developed over hundreds and maybe even thousands of years at this point, okay? And so when you get to this covenant, it's still the Mosaic covenant, and it's still the Abrahamic covenant. There are two that still exist. And these are really affirmations of those covenants, and it's really starting to point to the very end where the Messiah is going to come, and that bloodline and that lineage and that heritage is passing down through these individuals. David would be the last covenant before the Messiah, right? Then back to, and we just read this a while ago, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says, I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I've been with you forever. You have gone, cut off all your enemies before you. I will make your name like the names of the greatest men on earth, which those people knew the Bible stories. They knew who Abraham was. They knew who Moses was. They knew who Noah was. They knew who Adam was. Those people read about those stories like we do. Historical figures that are important to them. But the thing is, God is telling David, I will establish my covenant with you, and he's confirming that. So this is the provisions of the Davidic covenant. I want you to point a couple things out to you before we get to it. Did everybody get their bookmark today when you came in? That should be your 6th one, okay? 7 provisions of the Davidic covenant. This will be an eternal dynasty. When he refers to the Chronicles and the Samuel passage I read to you, he talks about your son is going to build my house. Okay, and of course he's talking about Solomon. And this is before David becomes the king and goes to war, and David becomes a warrior of such prowess that, like, one time when back when he was even servant to Saul, he said, "Bring me the foreskins of 100 Philistines," and he brings him 200. I mean, he's a pretty intense soldier, and as he gets older, he's got a group of men around. They call him the mighty men, the warriors of David. There's 300 of his closest, tightest, like ninja type guys that are so intense as soldiers. And they, as you know, a lot of this time they're spent, they're subservient to another country and fighting each other. And the Philistines are leftover people that God had told them at one point before Saul, you need to destroy these people completely. And then they didn't. And actually during Saul's reign, they didn't, the Amalekites. And that becomes the people that become the Philistines. And God tells them, hey, they're going to be a thorn on your side forever and ever and ever. But this eternal dynasty is pointing not only to Solomon as the son of David and the seed of David, but he's pointing down the line where he says, my kingdom and my house will be established forever with your sons, not just those sons directly, Solomon and down, but going on to 28 generations pointing to Jesus himself, right? That really is the eternal dynasty, which we live under the Messianic covenant. We live under the Messiah. And past us, when God returns and Christ comes in again, there will be more to that, the inheritor of the eternal throne, okay? I kind of covered that there. The Solomon, which was not the firstborn son of David. The firstborn son of David was the one he had with Bathsheba that died. Solomon was the replacement for that. And so Solomon was born out of a deal that was a sin, basically. And that becomes David's not crutch, but that becomes his thorn for his whole life. God says, you'll be punished for that. But that son from that becomes the replacement, will become the one that, I mean, if you look back upon all the people of the world, he's one of the wealthiest, wisest people that existed in biblical history. Wrote the book of Proverbs, most of it, wrote Song of Solomon, wrote a lot of that stuff that we read, right? Solomon would build the temple. Of course, again, going back to what David was this warrior. And when David actually attacked a city at the time wasn't called Jerusalem, the Jebusites owned it. He attacked it. He took Jerusalem as part of the city, and he developed it into the capital of Israel. Of course, Jerusalem is even to this day is the most important city in Israel. It was David who established that. And David goes to God and says, hey, I want to build you a permanent house. This tabernacle is not enough. And God says, no, you're not the one, because you have blood on your hands. You've had to fight for this. You've killed men. You've done under instruction from me. But it's not going to be you, but your son is going to one that builds the temple. And we talked about a little bit that last time about the party that they had and the sacrifices and the thousands of animals. A big, elaborate structure. And that was, like I said, that temple was destroyed in 580, and it stood about 400 years. So it was during Solomon's lifetime, so 938 BC or something, about the time it was established. And then the throne of David, talked about this a little bit already, that it's a forever thing. It's a lineage thing. Not only does it come through Solomon and his sons, but it goes through the others. Solomon would sin. You ever read the book of Ecclesiastes? You should, because late in Solomon's life, as he starts to question things, and he has his writings become full of sorrow, it's because he started to question the sins that he has done. Solomon had wives, like thousands of them, and done some things that he shouldn't have, and is starting to talk to God about it. But God tells him, and we can go back and read that, my loving kindness, the Hasid, is going to be established, and you can't mess it up. You can't break it. So that, again, that's the booster from Abraham all the way till now, 28 generations, saying you can't mess this up. This is something that I'm going to stay with you, which is why I pointed out in the past too, the Israelis, They are still the protected people of God. Now, things have changed with them, but not in that part. The Messiah will be of the lineage of David. He will come from the house of Judah. This is brought back as far back into the books of the Bible where it begins to be predicted, and that between David and Jesus, there's a lot of prophecies that are going to be told that will be foretold. I told you about one of them, about when Israel would be reestablished again. And sin cannot erode this promise. I just said that too. It's Abrahamic. It comes all the way from him. You cannot mess this up. The promise is going to remain with you and your family. And we are. One thing I should point out too, if you think about all these people we've talked about, and you talk about Abraham, and he tried to make that God had told him he was going to be, his sons were going to be, he was going to be the father of many nations, and he has his son Eleazar, and he tries to force that guy, and then he has relations with Hagar, and he thinks that's going to be the son. That sin, let's be honest, has led to what we watch unfold in our news coverage 4,000 years later, right? The battles that the Arab people fight with the Israelis every day is left over from then. So these guys are not perfect. David certainly was not perfect. He had an affair with a married woman and had her husband killed, which is that's, if you got to rank sins, which we're not ranking them, are we? That's a pretty bad deal, right? So you look at these people, and David certainly suffered for that. His son Absalom was an absolute terror to society and tried to kill David more than once and rebelled against him and his other sons. He dealt with that his whole adult life, during his whole adult kingdom, right? We're not perfect, much like they aren't, even though these are the patriarchs of the Bible. Jeremiah 22. Somebody have that? Billy's got that. Haley.
I'll try to pronounce his name.
Yeah, good luck with that one. I gave you that one on purpose. I'm going to read 25, 26, 27. Sorry.
Okay. I will deliver you into the hands of those who want to kill you, those you fear, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and the Babylonians. I will hurl you and your mother who gave you birth into another country, where neither of you was born, and there you both will die.
So this is the names that Billy read there, Jehoiachin and then Jehoiakim, both kings of Judah, both descendants of David. And he declares the Lord, Jehoiachin's going to be the one that passes on the promise of God. But at this point, you're talking about when the Babylonians had come and taken the Israelis and dragged them over to Babylon and had them in captivity. There was a point in time, we've talked about all this Jewish law in the last month or two, about the temple and the Ark of the Covenant and all these traditions. There's some point in time, in that point in history, where the Jews didn't worship anymore. They had forgot how to be Jews. All these laws and stuff, we just kind of look back and say, well, there's a couple thousand years of that. But at that point in time, they didn't even have any of that stuff going on. They didn't have a temple. And when they returned back to Jerusalem, they had to dig out all the old scrolls and the stuff and reread and relearn how to be Jews again. And that's referring to that even though those days were dark, and even though those days they were not following the Lord and he had put them into captivity, punishing them for not upholding their end of the bargain, the promise had never disappeared. So he had told David, this is eternal and the promise is never going away. Which, to me, that's about the Messianic covenant too, about what God promises eternal life to us is no different. It's just an extension of that. When Jesus comes and he's going to extend the grace and the promise to Gentiles as well as Jews, that's all a part of that. So as David gets this covenant from God and God talks to him, and David is a prolific writer in the Old Testament, right? He wrote most of the Psalms. He wrote a lot of songs. He wrote poems. 1 Chronicles 17, does somebody have that? Jared? Wait for Haley. She wants to make sure you project. This is David's response to the Lord. As you see, this is him talking directly to God and saying, all right, this is my agreement to this covenant.
There is none like you, O Lord. There is no God beside you, according to all that we have heard from with our ears. And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth, whom God went to redeem to be his people, making for yourself a name for great and awesome things, in driving out nations before your people, whom you redeemed from Egypt. And you made your people Israel to be your people forever. And you, O Lord, became their God. And now, O Lord, let the word that you have spoken concerning your servant and concerning his house be established forever, and do as you have spoken. And your name will be established and magnified forever, saying, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, is Israel's God. And the house of your servant David will be established before you. For you, my God, have revealed to your servant that you will build a house for him. Therefore your servant has found courage to pray before you. And now, O Lord, you are God, and you have promised this good thing to your servant. Now you have been pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever before you. For it is you, O Lord, who have blessed, and it is blessed forever.
Have you heard that thing? The only thing you have in this world is your name, your good name. Do you believe that? I mean, I have faith in Jesus, and that gives me my name. But the thing that you want to pass down to your kids is what? That heritage of godliness, right? That's the most important thing. When you look back at this kind of deal and David's response to that covenant, he says, do as you promised. I'm taking this on. It will be established. Your name will be great forever, that this heritage will be passed on. At this point, David didn't have those kids that were very nice, but he knew that God had told him he would be punished and his sins would be punished on this earth and he would struggle. But in the end, those promises would be carried down to generation. He's speaking down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years down the line. You, my God, revealed your servant. You will build a house for him, so your servant has found courage to pray for you. You, Lord, are God. You have promised these good things to your servant. He's embracing this. Go to Psalm 105. This is a fairly long psalm, and I'm going to read it to you. This is so many of the psalms that David wrote were a celebration and a reflection on that covenant that God had established with him. Again, we've all sinned. We've asked forgiveness in our heart if we're children of God. So we cling to that, about the stuff that we know that we're going to be redeemed from and restored from. This is an example of one of those psalms that David wrote. Sometimes when you read the Bible, like I told you when we started this study, as you hang the Bible on these covenants, it's the story of these people through the covenants with God. David is one of the ones that gave so much flesh to this stuff that, the poems and the songs, prolific writer. So read with me. You don't have to read with me, but read along as I read this and listen to the words that he talks about as a man. Give praise to the Lord. Proclaim his name. Make known among the nations what he has done. Sing to him. Sing praise to him. Tell of all his wonderful acts. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord in his strength. Seek his face always. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles and the judgments he pronounced. You, his servants, the descendants of Abraham, his chosen ones, the children of Jacob. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the promise he made for 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham, the oath he swore to Isaac. He confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, that to Israel as an everlasting covenant. To you I will give the land of Canaan as the portion that you will inherit. When they were few but in number, few indeed, strangers in it, they wandered from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another. He allowed no one to oppress them. For their sake he rebuked kings. Do not touch my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm. He called down famine on the land. He destroyed all the supplies of food. He sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with shackles. His neck was put in irons. To what he foretold came to pass. To the word of the Lord proved him true. The king sent and released him. The ruler of peoples set him free. He made him master of his household, ruler over all he possessed, to instruct his princes as he pleased, and to teach his elders wisdom. Then Israel entered Egypt. Jacob resided as a foreigner in the land of Ham. The Lord made his people very fruitful. He made them too numerous for their foes. whose hearts he turned to hate his people, to conspire against his servants. He sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They performed his signs among them, his wonders in the land of Ham. He sent darkness and made the land dark, for they had not rebelled against his words. He turned their waters into blood, causing their fish to die. Their land teemed with frogs, which went up into the bedrooms of their rulers. He spoke, and there came swarms of flies and gnats through their country, turned their rain into hail with lightning through the land. He struck down their vines and fig trees, and shattered the trees of their country. He spoke, and the locusts came, grasshoppers without number. They ate up every green thing in their land, ate up the produce of their soil. He struck down all the firstborn in their land, the first fruits of their manhood. He brought Israel, laden with silver and gold, and from among their tribes no one faltered. Egypt was glad when they left, because dread of Israel had fallen on them. He spread out a cloud as a covering, and a fire give light at night. They asked, and he brought them quail. He fed them well with the bread of heaven. He opened the rock, and the water gushed out. It flowed like a river in the desert. For he remembered his holy promise given to his servant Abraham. He brought out his people with rejoicing, his chosen ones with shouts of joy. He gave them the lands of the nations. They fell to heir to what others had toiled for, that they might keep his precepts and observe his laws. Praise the Lord. I think one of the things that I want you to take from this is there are certain things in this life, like these promises that God made with these men and with us, these covenants that are true and they are everlasting, and they do not change with time. You know, David writes that whole story about it was his history. It was the Jewish history that he talked about. Stories that those people would have known, just like we know about the Bible stories today. That it's important to them because they're true and they don't change. I think Barry's mentioned that the plurality of the world right now, in that so many things are considered holy, or there's can be a number of ways to heaven, and all of it's good as long as you're a good person. And it doesn't matter the time frame or the era or the century that we're in. Some of these things that God promised to us, they don't change. And that's the comforting thing to me about that, in that those things are rock solid that you can build your life upon, that building your life on the rock but not on the sand. Because it doesn't matter what day and era we live in, right? Sin is sin, truth is truth, God is God. And just like David and those people relished that promise that they had been given, it's no different for us in this world, again, that's filled with this spiritual warfare. We talked about that. Yes, there are spiritual beings among us. Yes, there are beings that were at the cross when Jesus died, and they know the story. And they also know the story of how it ends. But again, it's truth through generations of people that never changes. I want you to get that from this whole study, is that through several thousand years of human history, that becomes the common thing. And as we work our way to the Messiah, we'll talk about David next week and about some more of his stories. But as we work our way to the Messiah, those things are woven together and built upon each other. And that's what I wanted to bring